The U.S. government's financial priorities are under scrutiny after Americans in the path of two major hurricanes were left stranded, while their taxes went to fund wars abroad. I'm Anelise Borges, and this is The Stream.
People are dying out there.
And now law enforcement and first responders are telling people who don't evacuate, hey, write your name on your body and your date of birth in permanent markers so that if we do find you, at least we can identify you.
What about us? What am I paying for? I'm paying for you to go unalive people in other countries while you allow people to be unalived in this country without doing anything about it?
If this is not a wake-up call that our government is not for us, then I don't know what is.
Hurricane Milton's coming. Please, Mr. President, we need your help.
Do not fear. We are sending $20 billion worth of aid.
Oh, thank God.
To Israel.
After Hurricanes Milton and Helene, a lack of coordination in the government's disaster response left thousands of people waiting for help that they say never arrived, which sparked a heated debate online, with many questioning why billions of tax dollars are directed to military aid abroad while funds for aid at home falter. From climate resilience to education to housing and childcare, Americans say their money should be invested in solving issues that are critical to them first. To discuss, we are joined today by Sarah Deyoung, Associate Professor at the University of Delaware's Disaster Research Center, Lindsay Koshgarian, Program Director at the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, and Stephen Semler, Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Center for International Policy. Thank you all so much for being part of the show today. Let's begin this episode, though, with what residents faced when those storms hit. Take a look.
Something that I don't think people out of state are realizing is not everyone can actually get out. The gas stations are empty and the traffic is at a complete standstill. Even if we wanted to leave, we only have 100 miles until empty on our car. And I'm not even exaggerating when I say we went to 10 gas stations and there was no gas.
Many people question our actions and ask why we didn't evacuate, but I can tell you why. So I am a disabled person with limited mobility. I have limited energy and my body's in pain 24/7 unless I'm taking medication. So not only am I responsible for myself, but I'm also responsible for my elderly parents who live at home with me. My dad has dementia and needs 24-hour care and gets very disoriented when he's not in a familiar environment. And in addition to that, we have 3 dogs with us. So when the government says evacuate without providing any resources, without providing anything, it's basically every man for themselves. Go ahead and get in your car and drive far away is just a risk that I can't take.
There are so many very difficult testimonies of what people went through when these storms hit. Sarah, what is your view on how the government handled the response to the hurricanes?
Well, the United States has a system known as the National Response Framework, and that's supposed to be a tiered system of response in which the federal government supports the state government and the state government supports the local government. So the idea is that the local government should always be the first responders in a severe crisis like Hurricane Helene or Hurricane Milton. The problem is that the people in the local government and even local journalists and all of the residents in Western North Carolina after Hurricane Helene were directly impacted. And so there was a bit of a lag in terms of even understanding the scope of the catastrophic damage.
I really want to understand more on why that is as well, but I want to get Lindsay, because we heard there from the residents, right? They couldn't even evacuate if they wanted to. There was no help. I mean, the conversation online quickly turned to what the response should have looked like. What have you heard and seen when it comes to what people went through?
Well, I know that this is probably the second most destructive hurricane in recent years in the United States, Hurricane Helene, and it's just devastating. There are many people who are still missing. There are more than 250 people who've died. It's truly devastating. And the clip you played at the beginning with the person talking about putting their names on their bodies in case they needed to be identified really resonated, because it reminded me that people in Gaza are doing the same thing. And both of those are things that the U.S. federal government is responsible for.
You make a very important parallel, and we're going to get to Gaza a little later. But Stephen, you've written about this, about how this administration has not prioritized domestic spending. I mean, while sending billions of dollars to Israel, Ukraine. In one of your articles, you actually compared what became the $95 billion National Security Act with a proposal, and you write, half its size to fund domestic programs such as childcare and disaster relief. Can you tell us more about that and what this administration's priorities have been?
Sure. Budgets are a reflection of values. And in America, when the president wants money for something, he has to ask Congress, and that comes in the form of proposals. So this time last year, almost exactly this time last year, Biden released two funding proposals. One became his massive foreign aid bill, and the other became it became nothing, actually. It was just a proposal that included $9 billion for disaster relief fund and FEMA, and for other domestic priorities as well. And the reason why you haven't heard of the second one probably is because Biden never mentioned it after he released it. Meanwhile, his first funding request for foreign aid, it was the subject of an Oval Office address. No other priority has given an Oval Office address to market. The full proposal was the subject of intense lobbying by the Biden administration for months until it passed, while I couldn't find a single instance of Biden ever mentioning the domestic proposal once after he introduced it in last October.
And that speaks volumes, obviously, exactly what you said on the reflection of the values of this administration, but other administrations as well. I mean, we want to go back to more historical context as well. But Sarah, Helene and Milton losses are expected to surpass $50 billion each, and most of the damage was not insured. What does that mean for the people, for these victims?
Yeah, so a lot of the damage occurred in communities that were already marginalized and vulnerable before the hurricanes. And something that's commonly known and accepted through empirical data and disaster research is that when communities are more vulnerable before the disaster and they lack funds to even survive on a day-to-day basis, they're going to be pushed even further to the margins after these catastrophic hurricanes. I mean, 60% of Americans can't afford a $500 emergency, whether that be a medical bill or a car accident. And so when these hurricanes occur in those communities where folks are already struggling, it makes it a lot harder for them to recover. And the road to recovery is going to take not just months, but many, many years for so many of these communities.
And obviously everyone there is left wondering why. Meanwhile, the U.S. is the #1 country when it comes to military spending and selling weapons around the world. Lindsay, how much does the so-called U.S. war machine actually cost? And what is the U.S. military budget today?
So the U.S. military budget for this past fiscal year, the next year is yet to be set, but for this past fiscal year, it was over $950 billion. And that's before they passed additional billions of dollars for Israel and Ukraine. So it's quickly approaching $1 trillion every year. And that's roughly how much the U.S. spends on domestic priorities like housing, public health, public education, the environment, and also foreign humanitarian aid all combined. So it's also one of the biggest military budgets in history. You have to go all the way back to World War II before you can find a military budget that approaches where we are today.
Wow. And of course, once again, that says a lot about how America has prioritized this kind of spending over decades. And it makes us understand as well the anger of people, right? On social media, many people shared their disappointment over the funding of the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, in the context of the response to the hurricanes. Take a look.
So Congress did not approve a $10 billion increase to FEMA's budget while we're in the middle of a hurricane. Okay, they didn't add it. They said no. So essentially they're cutting FEMA's budget. And now they're on recess for the next 6 weeks. Did you know that? Did you know that the United States Congress, they're not there right now. If you need them, they're gone. Okay? They are on recess for the next 6 weeks. This is their schedule. Okay? Do you see this? They just got back from summer break not long ago, and now they're on another 6-week break while people are stuck.
Stephen, we said this before. This is not something that is exclusive to this administration. Over the years, we've seen the U.S. spending a lot of money on military and military aid to other countries. Is there a parallel here, for example, when it comes to what happened back in 2005 with Katrina and the U.S. was busy fighting in Iraq? And why do you think the U.S. insists on fighting so much abroad while there's so much to be done at home?
I think for the most part, while there is daylight, between Republicans and Democrats on domestic policy, there really is increasingly little daylight between those two parties on foreign policy. But I think for the most part, when you ask about why there's a fixation or obsession with foreign affairs over domestic priorities, I think it comes down to just an absence of class interests when it comes to policymaking. In my opinion, the earth belongs to labor, and policies should be developed with working class interests in mind, and that should be the primary consideration. But if you're rich, you're a politician, and if you're a politician, you're rich. So, I think the problem is that they just don't have working class values in mind when they make policies. They can afford to think about how to intervene in different foreign affairs that aren't necessarily in U.S. interests, especially not in U.S. interests if it's aiding and abetting Israeli war crimes. But for the most part, it's just an absence of priorities on the most urgent and critical needs facing the working class.
And obviously, people seem to be getting more and more acquainted with that reality. These funds, and it's important to note here, they obviously don't come from the same budget, and some budgetary decisions are made way in advance, making it hard to simply switch gears when a storm is coming. But many U.S. citizens are angry and questioning where their taxes are being spent, for example. And on that, I would like to bring into the conversation now Ahmad Abuznaid. He is the executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, who put together Not My Tax Dollars. Ahmed, thank you so much for your time. What does your initiative help Americans do?
Our goal at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights is to get to a point where we effectively end all military aid to the state of Israel. In this current moment, the contradictions are being made clear for the average taxpayer in the United States. When we have disasters like hurricanes, we're being told we don't have enough funds to support our people dealing with the brunt of these storms. However, in these same moments, we're seeing billions of dollars shipped over to Israel to continue its genocidal war. So let me take a step back and just say, first and foremost, we're witnessing a genocide. And ethically and morally, we have to do something to stop that. Not only is it ethically and morally objectifiable, but it's against international and U.S. law. Now let's get to the U.S. tax. The U.S. taxpayer is being bamboozled. We're being told we don't have enough for schools or healthcare, and yet we see billions going off to support this Israeli genocide. So our tool we thought would be useful for the average taxpayer to actually visualize. What could my community be gaining if we weren't spending money on all of those bombs, killing innocents in Gaza, in Lebanon, so on and so forth.
Interesting. And once people are educated with those parallels, with what their money could actually be spent on in their best interests, what can they do if they don't agree to where the money is going? I mean, should they just not pay taxes? Is that a legal thing?
Yeah, I think they would have to consult with their legal counsel and their tax counsel if they were going to make that decision. But in the meantime, we can advocate. We can let these elected representatives that are supposed to represent our interest as U.S. taxpayers, that are supposed to protect us and our futures, our children's futures, our children's health care. We should advocate and let those people know that we reject this status quo foreign policy. We actually want to see those dollars invested in schools. We want our teachers to see increase in wages. We want free health care for U.S. taxpayers. These are the things that we talk about as average citizens in this country when we think about how our government is failing us. And so to, again, see morally and ethically us making the wrong decision, but also strategically making the wrong decision to to disinvest from our communities and to invest in war and genocide. So the hope is that they would use this information and advocate for a better future for us all.
Ahmad Abuznaid, thank you so much for your project. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and hopefully people will check it out. Not My Tax Dollars. Thank you so much for joining us here on the stream. And let's get our guests back now. Sarah, Lindsay, and Stephen, thank you so much for staying put. Lindsay, is tax resistance a good idea here? And what else can be done if not?
Yeah, it's certainly one of the only ideas that people have, because unfortunately our system is broken and it's really difficult for people to influence it. But it's not the only way. We also track where tax dollars go, and we found that last year the average taxpayer paid 30 times as much for the Pentagon and military as they did for disaster relief. So that's over $3,000, nearly $4,000 per taxpayer for the military, and just $119 for disaster relief. So you can see where the priorities are right there. And we also have a tax receipt that we show people so that they can see where all these dollars are going. Next year it will be even worse because the military budget has gotten bigger. Tax resistance is one option, but it's also actually very important that people vote and that people let their representatives know how they're feeling. Because if you remember, the U.S. system is broken, and there's too much money involved, and there are people who are trying to buy the votes of people in the votes of people in Congress. But the way they're doing that is by influencing voters. And so if we refuse to be influenced, then we can take back control of our political system.
And obviously, there's a major political event happening this year. And during this big debate over the lack of funds for victims, Donald Trump, the U.S. presidential candidate, supported a GoFundMe campaign that raised nearly $8 million. Sarah, many people criticized this move, saying it was a PR stunt. Others welcomed the funds raised. When we chatted before the show, you said something very powerful that stuck with me. You said disasters are political. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, and especially in view of the elections that are coming up?
That fundraising that Donald Trump is doing is in many ways irrelevant, because there are voluntary organizations active in disasters, along with the federal government and other informal systems. So it's just a drop in the bucket, really, in terms of support. But let's be clear, going back all the way to 2003 during the Bush administration, the reason why FEMA has been consolidated under the Department of Homeland Security is that there was an effort to move funding from natural hazard mitigation to counterterrorism and cybersecurity, which ended up making Hurricane Katrina in many ways worse, because there were less funds for natural hazard mitigation. And so thinking about, the big picture of those priorities are really, really critical and important in understanding the historical context of emergency management as well.
Thank you so much for contextualizing Katrina as well. Lindsay, your thoughts on whether what the U.S. should be spending its money on, maybe its people, will actually do something to sway the vote this year?
It's a great question. It's certainly not considered one of the top issues in this election. You generally hear that that's the economy, and maybe it's immigration.
But that is the economy, right? Is directly affecting what they can and cannot do and how they're surviving in these crises.
It is, but it's not how people are thinking of the economy. They're thinking of the economy as jobs and wages, and a lot of people don't understand the connections between these two things. And I also want to point out that another thing that we've underinvested in terribly in this country is addressing climate change. We found, for instance, that in the 20 years after 9/11, as part of the U.S. response, we spent $21 trillion, and that for less than a quarter of that, we could have revamped the entire U.S. energy grid to renewable energy. And we chose not to do that. That was a policy decision. And I think one problem is that voters are not terribly well informed. They tend to give Trump a lot of credit for how the economy went under his watch, which tanked at the end of his watch under COVID. And they just aren't making the connections. They aren't paying enough attention. So I think that's a real problem. But a lot of voters are anti-war. And I think it's also been underestimated how much that has played into people's recent presidential decisions. And you even hear people today saying that they support a candidate because they see them as the anti-war candidate.
Wow. Do you think that social media has done anything to change that in terms of educating people? I mean, we've been seeing so much online when it comes to where the money is going, where, as we just said, where the money could be going. So is there any difference this year? Would you say, are people starting at least to make certain connections?
Many people are. It's not enough yet. But social media certainly makes a difference, and especially because in the United States, you really don't see a lot of mainstream media coverage of these issues. You don't see enough mainstream media coverage that questions war. A lot of it is pro-war, or at least very permissive of whatever the administration wants to be doing. So social media is one of the only places where people can find this information. And so I definitely think it's helping. And also we know from polling that younger people in the United States who tend to be more on social media also have a different approach to how they want to see the U.S. in the world. They're less likely to want to see the U.S. As the #1 power or an exceptional power. They're more likely to see the U.S. as just one of many countries in the world and see that we need to rebalance how we prioritize ourselves and how we militarize the world. So I think it is moving in a good direction for younger people who tend to be on social media.
Right. Stephen, your take here. Do you think that this right direction will be enough to actually make a difference in this year's election? Will people actually be more informed when they go vote? Or, I don't know, these hurricanes will just be more hurricanes and there will be others and people won't actually be connecting these dots when casting a ballot in November?
People may not know what the unemployment rate is. They may not know what the U.S. GDP is, but they know how they feel. And how they feel is largely determined by human security variables, namely the first two, financial security and food insecurity, both measures of which are worse than they were when Biden took office. Now, there was an immediate improvement under the American Rescue Plan passed under Biden, but over the next few years, that was passed in 2021, since then, those programs that were passed under that expired. And they were supposed to be made permanent under this program that Biden essentially campaigned on called Build Back Better. But he essentially stopped fighting for Build Back Better in March 2022 after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And he totally stopped mentioning it, and he started talking more about cutting spending and deficit reduction instead of, building up and making permanent this U.S. welfare state. So as a result, this welfare state was being torn down, services were being taken away, while at the same time, there's a serious bout of inflation. So people were really, it's been described as whiplash, and I think that's a good term for it, is because they're being hit with a double whammy. One, they're losing programs related to childcare, related to, the stimulus checks, which were effectively a tax cut, while at the same time dealing with much higher prices. So since 2020, food prices, average household food prices, and wages just haven't really caught up with that. So people know how they feel. So I think the lack of government assistance will be at the forefront of people's minds. I don't think Trump has a solution for it, but I know that there's serious anger with Biden right now. And had he remained committed to that social welfare package, child poverty would still be at a record low, but instead it's increased over the last 2 years.
And it's obviously...
If I might add...
Absolutely. Very briefly, though, Lindsay, because we're almost out of time, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just say that the U.S. has a long history, of course, of these terrible military invasions, and going back to the Vietnam War and further back, all of those things break down trust in the federal government. And that has a spillover effect to where people want to see the federal government involved domestically. And so there's a big anti-government movement in this country. And I think part of that can be attributed to people's anti-government response to what the government is doing overseas in wars. And that's been true for decades.
And it's going to be very interesting, once again, to actually watch what's happening. Unfortunately, we are out of time today, but I want to thank Lindsay, Sarah, and Stephen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being part of the stream today. And thank you all for tuning in. Do stay in touch with us on social media. You can use the hashtag or the handle AJStream. Take care, and I'll see you soon.